Wolves are a mysterious, highly intelligent creature. Living at the top of the food chain, they are effective predators, hunting in packs as a family unit. Native American tribes had great respect for wolves. They had strong spiritual connections to them. But over the span of history, it's rare that wolves have been able to coexist with European man. Wolves evoked fear in Grimm's fairy tale classic Little Red Riding Hood, dating back to the 10th century. Wolves were exterminated in Northern Europe by the Middle Ages. To many, they were the symbol of the devil. European immigrants brought those viewpoints with them when they settled America. As civilization grew, wolves were pushed into the western frontier, the Rocky Mountains. In the mid-1800s, settlers came west on the Oregon Trail. Hundreds of thousands of people, with the dream of greener pastures, moved west from the 1840s to the 1880s. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged pioneers to stake their own piece of land, up to 160 acres, for no charge. They were required to farm the land, improve it, and stay for 5 years. About 40% of them were successful. Over the next 70 years, the federal government granted 1.6 million homesteads, covering 270 million acres of land. This is how much of the West was settled. Ranchers homesteaded on creek bottoms where they could raise hay and livestock, and they ran cattle and sheep in the mountains surrounding the ranches on what was then public domain. In 1890, Idaho became a state and joined the Union with a population of 88,000. George Shoup was the first governor of Idaho. 10 years later, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game was created, run by the state game warden. Deputy wardens were hired in every county of Idaho. During this time of westward expansion and development, wolves and other feared predators, such as mountain lions, were trapped, shot, and poisoned. The priority was to civilize the West, and predators were seen as the enemy.
My grandmother moved to Peavey, Idaho in 1906. She was the first, last, and only postmaster at Peavey. And she carried my dad, who was the oldest of her kids, around their land planting poplar trees. She carried him in a basket. And she raised 7 kids, and milk supply was really important. They had a milk cow. Both my maternal grandmothers had milk cows. And something that would harm that milk cow was not welcome at all, because that was really important to growing family, growing kids, a supply of milk. There was no C-store to go get, a half gallon of milk. It was go out there and get some before the calf did. The chickens and the milk cow and maybe a few beef cattle and a horse or two were really, really important, and the wolves were a threat to all of that. They were all there. There were wolves, there were coyotes, there were mountain lions, a lot of threats. The base food supply was threatened with all these animals that wanted to eat red meat. Something gets in and kills all the chickens. It was survival.
In 1914, state of Idaho enacts a bounty on mountain lions, $50 per animal. The next year, elk were transplanted from Yellowstone National Park into eastern Idaho. At the federal level, the U.S. Biological Survey was charged with the responsibility of eliminating wolves and other predators in the West. The Animal Damage Control Act, passed by Congress in 1931, gave the Secretary of Agriculture broad authority to expand the destruction of mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, prairie dogs, gophers, ground squirrels, jackrabbits, and other animals injurious to agriculture, horticulture, forestry, or that carried disease. The purpose of predator control was to reduce predator attacks on farms and ranches and protect the nation's food supply. By the mid-1930s, wolves were believed to be extirpated from Idaho and the northern Rockies.
It was a lot better to have the government involved and a bunch of ranchers out there with some very exotic poisons and things. And it enabled the government to do it as efficiently as they possibly can. People who were trained to handle and do these things and know what the rules are. If you're setting traps for animals, it's important to recognize that a lot of people worry about the suffering, and those traps need to be checked often. And with the government doing it, it will be done that way.
During the Great Depression, a new law was passed called the Taylor Grazing Act, which would bring much-needed order to livestock grazing in the public domain, known today as BLM lands. Prior to the law, range wars erupted between cattle and sheep outfits over who controlled the land.
The Taylor Grazing Act was put a referee in a very contentious neighbor against neighbor. There was too much animal agriculture, and it was whoever raced and got to the watering hole first. It was a bad situation. It needed to cut the numbers down some and bring some organization to it. And it was a law that came just in time, I think, to stabilize the grazing industry. And
under the Taylor Grazing Act, ranchers could apply for permits to graze livestock on public lands for a small fee. The permits were subject to renewal every 10 years. Ranchers with homesteads or base property received preference for grazing permits.
They got people to agree where they had a right to graze and where their neighbor had a right to graze.
During the mid-1930s, known as the Dust Bowl era, a new emphasis was placed on soil and water conservation, halting erosion on farmlands, but also on rangelands. Following World War II, the United States embarked on an unprecedented economic boom. In the West, logging, mining, and livestock grazing expanded during a time of rapid industrialization and business development across America. The paradigm was to get back to business following the war. No one saw any limits to development. 1970, Earth Day causes a big sea change in America in terms of environmental awareness. Rivers and lakes were so polluted that some caught on fire. Air pollution was a severe problem in some industrial areas. Many new American laws were enacted as a wave of environmental consciousness swept the nation. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act were among the new laws created. At the same time, the membership of environmental organizations expanded, giving environmentalists more clout in Congress and in the courts. In 1974, the same year former President Nixon resigned over Watergate, Rocky Mountain gray wolves were listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. In the late 1980s, the Fish and Wildlife Service started to hold public meetings about the possibility of reintroducing wolves into the northern Rocky Mountains, in Yellowstone National Park, and in central Idaho. This was one of the most controversial and emotional issues to surface in modern history. Urban environmentalists supported wolf reintroduction to bring a top predator back to the North Rockies ecosystem. Nearly all ranchers and big game hunters opposed it, fearing what would happen to big game herds and livestock.
They were very contentious because the wolf is the wolf, but it's a symbol. In so many ways, it's a symbol of, to some people, a West that they thought they'd taken care of the wolf, gotten rid of it. I mean, we come west, and then the wolf is exterminated because it's bad. You know, we're supposed to be settling the West. This is America, this is progress, this is manifest destiny. It's good to get rid of that predator. Then, we realized through ecology and other things that the wolf sort of belonged here in terms of what was here in the ecosystem. When a new world says, we just simply want to repair something we did, not put the wolf everywhere, certainly. And those two values clash, the kind of modern environmental ecosystem view against more the natural resources as resources to be used and cultivate and even dominate.
Wolves were a native species to Idaho throughout the northern Rockies. Wolves play a unique role in the ecosystem. They help cull disease and overproduction of elk and deer so that the elk and deer populations remain healthier as a whole. Wolves have a huge role to play that has a beneficial ripple effect across the ecosystem.
Ultimately, the process was political. A huge number of people engaged in the process, not only in the Rocky Mountains, but nationwide. Approximately 165,000 public comments were received. A majority favored wolf reintroduction. In the early 1990s, President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was in the White House. His Interior Secretary, Bruce Babbitt, favored wolf reintroduction.
Let's face it, Bruce Babbitt fits this stereotypical role, and I say that, I'm not judging the role, but Western governor becomes Secretary of Interior, like Cecil Andrus, right? They're not coastal liberals here, but they understand the West and all the values. So a lot of that had to do with Babbitt, not Clinton. And Clinton was from Arkansas. What does he know, right? And so Babbitt really, wanted to do things during that era. A Republican president probably would not have done that. He would have heard from Republican governors in the West saying, you do not want to be doing this.
Under the reintroduction program, the Fish and Wildlife Service classified the wolves as an experimental, non-essential population. That meant the states and Fish and Wildlife Service had more latitude in killing or controlling wolves if they preyed on livestock or caused too much impact on big game populations. The Fish and Wildlife Service set a recovery goal of 10 breeding pairs in Montana, central Idaho, and Wyoming, or 30 total. No wolves would be released in Montana because a number of gray wolves had established packs in the Glacier National Park area. Wolves were expected to expand on their own in that state. In 1995, 31 wolves were released into Yellowstone National Park, and 35 were released along the Salmon River at Corn Creek in central Idaho. The experiment had begun.